The afternoon of March 7th, 1945. The heights above Remagen, Germany. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter crouched behind the stone wall of a ruined bakery, his binoculars trembling as he focused on the American column emerging from the forest road below. What he saw made no sense according to everything German intelligence had told them about American armor capabilities. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. These were not Sherman tanks. The turrets were wrong. The hulls were different. The guns were enormous, far larger than the 75mm weapons the Shermans carried. And most unsettling of all, they moved with a confidence that suggested their crews knew they were invincible. Richter was looking at M26 Pershing heavy tanks, the newest American armoured fighting vehicles in the European theatre. His report, radioed to battalion headquarters 20 minutes later, would trigger a crisis of understanding among German tank commanders that went far beyond the immediate tactical situation at Remagen. The Americans had not merely built a tank that could match German heavy armour, they had built it in quantity, deployed it thousands of kilometres from their factories, and brought it to bear at the decisive moment when Germany's last natural defence was about to fall. The mathematics of armoured warfare were being rewritten not through incremental improvement, but through industrial transformation that German commanders had convinced themselves was impossible. The Americans were not supposed to have heavy tanks. They were certainly not supposed to have them here, now, at the most critical bridge crossing of the entire Western campaign. The Pershing that Richter observed through his binoculars bore the tactical number 3 painted on its turret. It belonged to F Company, 33rd Armoured Regiment, 3rd Armoured Division. Serial number USA 30103-209, built by Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, and shipped across the Atlantic in January of 1945. The tank had been in Europe for less than 60 days. Its crew had trained on it for barely 3 months. Yet here it was, leading an assault on the most heavily defended objective the Americans had encountered since crossing the German border. The presence of Pershings at Remagen represented something that German military intelligence had failed to predict, and that German industrial planners had assured their superiors was beyond American capability. The United States had designed, tested, produced, and deployed a heavy tank comparable to the German Tiger in less time than it took German factories to deliver a single battalion's worth of Panthers. The Sherman tank, which German engineers had studied exhaustively at the Kummersdorf proving grounds, had taught them that American automotive reliability was exceptional. The Pershing would teach them something far more disturbing. American industrial capacity could pivot from mass production of medium tanks to limited production of heavy tanks without disrupting overall output, could solve complex engineering problems in months rather than years, and could deploy advanced weapons systems to frontline units with a logistics efficiency that German planners considered theoretically impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of the Pershing tank begins not at Remagen, but in the desert of North Africa, where American tank crews first encountered German heavy armour and discovered that their Sherman tanks were outgunned. The summer of 1942 brought American forces into combat against German panzer divisions equipped with Tiger tanks mounting 88mm guns that could penetrate Sherman armour at ranges exceeding 2,000 metres. The Sherman's 75mm gun could barely scratch a Tiger's frontal armour even at close range. American tank doctrine, which emphasized mobility and reliability over armor protection and firepower, suddenly seemed inadequate when facing an enemy whose doctrine prioritized the opposite characteristics. The United States Army Ordnance Department had been working on heavy tank designs since 1940, but development had been deliberately slow. American military doctrine, heavily influenced by lessons from the First World War, emphasized infantry support tanks rather than tank versus tank combat. The assumption was that American tanks would primarily support infantry advances, destroying enemy fortifications and machine gun positions, while avoiding engagement with enemy armor whenever possible. This doctrine worked reasonably well against German light and medium tanks in North Africa. It collapsed completely when Tigers appeared on the battlefield in Tunisia during early 1943. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commanding Army Ground Forces and responsible for determining equipment requirements, initially resisted calls for American heavy tank development. McNair believed that American tank destroyers, purpose-built vehicles mounting high-velocity guns on lighter chassis, should handle enemy armor, while tanks focused on infantry support. This division of roles seemed logical in theory but proved disastrous in practice. Tank destroyer doctrine required them to wait in ambush positions for enemy tanks to appear, then engage from concealment. German tank crews refused to cooperate with this scenario. They attacked American positions with combined arms forces, using their Tigers and Panthers aggressively, while suppressing American tank destroyers with artillery and infantry. American tank crews, equipped with weapons inadequate for engaging heavy German armor, died in burning Shermans, while tank destroyers sat in rear areas waiting for tactical situations that never developed according to doctrine. The pressure for a better American tank came not from ordnance planners, but from combat commanders who watched their units take casualties that better equipment might have prevented. Major General Ernest Harmon, commanding the 1st Armoured Division in Italy, wrote scathing reports about Sherman inadequacies after his tanks encountered German heavy armor in the mountains south of Rome. Lieutenant General George Patton, commanding 3rd Army in France, demanded heavier tanks with more powerful guns after his armoured divisions faced Panthers and Tigers in the hedgerows of Normandy. Field commanders understood what staff officers in Washington did not. Tank crews needed weapons that could destroy any enemy tank they encountered. Anything less was a death sentence delivered by industrial inadequacy rather than tactical failure. The development of what would become the Pershing began in earnest during early 1943 under the designation T-26. The project faced immediate obstacles that revealed fundamental differences between American and German approaches to weapons development. German heavy tank design prioritized maximum performance specifications regardless of production complexity or logistical requirements. The Tiger tank mounted an 88mm gun derived from an anti-aircraft weapon, employed armor up to 100mm thick, and weighed 54 tons. These specifications created a formidable battlefield weapon, but also created a vehicle that German industry struggled to produce in meaningful numbers and that German logistics struggled to support in the field. American designers faced different constraints. Any new heavy tank had to be producible by existing tank factories without disrupting Sherman production. It had to be transportable by standard American tank transporters and by existing cargo ships. It had to be maintainable by mechanics trained on Shermans using tools and skills they already possessed. Most critically, it had to be deployable to Europe in sufficient numbers to make a tactical difference before the war ended. These constraints forced design compromises that German engineers would have rejected as limiting performance. The T-26 design team at Detroit Arsenal, led by engineers from Chrysler Corporation, applied automotive industry principles to heavy tank design, just as General Motors and Ford had done with the Sherman. The result was a vehicle that prioritized practical functionality over theoretical maximums, that accepted good enough rather than demanding perfect, and that could be built by workers whose primary experience was with automobiles rather than military vehicles. The T-26 went through multiple iterations as designers balanced competing requirements. The initial design mounted a 3-inch gun derived from anti-aircraft weapons, providing better armor penetration than the Sherman's 75mm, but still inadequate against the thickest German armor. Ordnance Department testing revealed that the 3-inch gun could not reliably penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at combat ranges. The design team switched to a 90mm gun, also derived from anti-aircraft weapons, that provided penetration capability roughly equivalent to the German 88mm. This change required enlarging the turret and strengthening the turret ring, modifications that delayed production but produced a tank capable of engaging any German armor on equal terms. The armor protection on the T-26 reflected American understanding of industrial limitations. The frontal armor was 100mm thick, comparable to the Panther, and sufficient to defeat most German anti-tank guns at reasonable combat ranges. The side armor was thinner, only 76mm, making the tank vulnerable to flank attacks. German designers would have demanded thicker all-around protection. American designers accepted the vulnerability as the price for keeping weight manageable and production feasible. The T-26 weighed 42 tons, substantially heavier than the 33-ton Sherman but lighter than the 45-ton Panther, and far lighter than the 54-ton Tiger. The weight reflected conscious decisions about what to prioritize. Thicker armor would have provided better protection but would have required a more powerful engine, stronger transmission, and heavier suspension components. Each improvement would have cascaded through the design, adding weight and complexity until the tank became too heavy to transport and too complex to maintain. The Americans chose adequacy over excellence, good enough over perfect, and deployment over development. The engine selected for the T-26 was the Ford GAA V8, the same engine used in the M4A3 Sherman variant. This choice simplified logistics enormously. Mechanics already knew how to maintain the engine. Spare parts were already in the supply system. Training requirements were minimal. The engine produced 500 horsepower, giving the heavier Pershing a power-to-weight ratio slightly lower than the Sherman, but still adequate for tactical mobility. German designers, by contrast, had developed the Maybach HL230 specifically for the Panther, a 700 horsepower engine that required specialized maintenance and unique spare parts. The German approach produced superior performance specifications on paper. The American approach produced engines that worked reliably in field conditions with minimal support requirements. The transmission represented another area where American and German design philosophies diverged fundamentally. The Pershing used a modified version of the Torquematic transmission developed for the Sherman, featuring herringbone-cut gears and synchronized shifting in the higher gears. The design prioritized ease of operation and reliability over theoretical efficiency. German transmissions, built to tighter tolerances with straight-cut gears, achieved slightly better power transfer but required constant expert maintenance and frequently failed under combat stress. American tank crews could shift gears smoothly without specialized training. German tank crews spent considerable time learning double-clutching techniques to avoid damaging their transmissions. The difference reflected broader assumptions about who would operate these vehicles and under what conditions. Production of the T-26, redesignated M26 and named Pershing after General John J. Pershing, commander of American forces in the First World War, began in November of 1944. Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, received the contract to build the first production run. The facility had been producing Sherman tanks since 1942 and employed 42,000 workers at peak production. Converting part of the factory to Pershing production required retooling but did not shut down Sherman output. This achievement, producing two different tank types simultaneously in the same facility, demonstrated American industrial flexibility that German planners considered impossible. German tank factories were typically dedicated to single vehicle types. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Switching from Panther to Tiger production required months of retooling and worker retraining. The Americans switched from Sherman to Pershing production in weeks, maintaining output of both types while training workers on the new vehicle. The first production Pershings rolled off the assembly line in December of 1944, barely 13 months after serious development work had begun. The timeline was extraordinary by any standard. German development of the Panther, from initial concept to production, had required over 2 years. The Tiger had required even longer. The Americans compressed the development cycle through ruthless prioritization of essential features over theoretical perfection. The Pershing was not the best possible heavy tank. It was the best heavy tank that could be produced quickly enough to matter in the current war. The decision to deploy Pershings to Europe was controversial within the Army Ordnance Department. Some officials argued that the tank had not been adequately tested and that shipping them overseas risked mechanical failures that would embarrass the Ordnance Department and undermine confidence in American equipment. Others argued that combat commanders needed heavier tanks immediately and that any defects could be addressed through field modifications. The debate was resolved by Lieutenant General Jacob Devers, commanding 6th Army Group in southern France. Devers demanded that Pershings be shipped to his command immediately, accepting responsibility for any mechanical problems that might develop. 20 Pershings were loaded onto cargo ships in January of 1945 and reached Europe in February. The tanks were distributed to units that had specifically requested them and whose commanders were willing to accept vehicles that lacked the proven reliability of the Sherman. The 3rd Armored Division received several Pershings and immediately assigned them to experienced crews. The Zebra mission, as the deployment was designated, represented a calculated risk by American logistics planners. Introducing a new tank type to combat units required spare parts, technical manuals, and specialized maintenance training. The Pershing shared many components with the Sherman, simplifying logistics somewhat, but it also incorporated unique systems that required new procedures and different tools. American logistics officers, drawing on years of experience supporting mechanized forces across multiple theaters, created streamlined supply chains that delivered Pershing spare parts directly to combat units without routing them through the entire depot system. German logistics, by comparison, struggled to deliver spare parts for existing vehicles and would have found introducing a new tank type mid-war logistically impossible. The first combat employment of the Pershing occurred on February 25, 1945, at the town of Elsdorf in western Germany. A single Pershing from F Company, 33rd Armored Regiment, 3rd Armored Division, commanded by Sergeant Nicholas Maschlonas, engaged a German Panzer IV tank at approximately 800 meters range. The 90mm gun penetrated the Panzer IV's frontal armor with a single round, destroying the tank instantly. The engagement proved what ordnance tests had predicted. The Pershing's main gun could defeat any German armor it encountered. The psychological impact on American tank crews was immediate and profound. Sergeant Maschlonas reported that his crew had felt confident throughout the engagement, knowing their armor could withstand return fire and their gun could penetrate any target they faced. This confidence, absent in Sherman crews who understood their vulnerability to German heavy tanks, transformed tactical behavior. Pershing crews engaged enemy armor aggressively rather than maneuvering for flank shots or waiting for tank destroyer support. German tank crews, accustomed to superiority over Shermans, suddenly faced American tanks that could destroy Panthers and Tigers in direct frontal engagements. The tactical balance was shifting in ways that German commanders had not anticipated and could not counter. The deployment of Pershings to the Remagen sector occurred almost by accident, a consequence of fluid operational planning rather than deliberate strategic design. 3rd Armored Division was conducting operations toward Cologne when 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge. Higher Command immediately ordered 3rd Armored Division to redirect toward Remagen to reinforce the bridgehead and support breakout operations. The division's Pershings, including the tank that Obergefreiter Richter would observe through his binoculars, moved south with the rest of the division. They reached Remagen on March 8, less than 24 hours after the bridge's capture. March 8, 1945. The eastern approaches to Remagen, Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann stood in the cupola of his Panther Ausführung G, watching American armor move through the bridgehead perimeter with a growing sense of tactical hopelessness. His battalion had been ordered to counterattack the American positions and drive them back across the Rhine, orders that seemed disconnected from the reality he was observing through his optics. The American tanks advancing toward his defensive positions were not the Shermans his crews had learned to engage with confidence. These were larger, heavier vehicles with substantially thicker armor and guns that appeared comparable to the 88mm weapons mounted on Tigers. Hoffmann had commanded Panthers since Kursk in the summer of 1943. He understood armored warfare at the tactical level, as well as any officer in the Wehrmacht. What he was seeing made no tactical sense, according to everything German intelligence had reported about American armored capabilities. The Americans were supposed to rely on numerical superiority rather than technical excellence. They were supposed to accept casualties from German heavy tanks as the price of their inferior equipment. They were not supposed to have tanks that could engage Panthers on equal terms. The intelligence failure was complete, and the tactical implications were immediately apparent to anyone who understood how armored combat actually worked in the field. The M26 Pershing tanks advancing into the Remagen bridgehead during the second week of March represented the convergence of American industrial, capacity with urgent tactical requirements. 3rd Armoured Division had received 20 Pershings in February, distributing them to experienced crews in companies that had been specifically requesting heavier tanks since the Battle of the Bulge. The crews selected for Pershing assignment were veterans who had survived months of combat in Shermans and who understood intimately the disadvantages of facing German heavy armour with inadequate weapons. Staff Sergeant Erling Elkins commanded one of the first Pershings to enter the Remagen bridgehead. His crew had been operating Shermans since Normandy and had lost 2 tanks to German fire during the advance across France. Elkins later described the psychological transformation that occurred when his crew received their Pershing. For the first time in months, they felt they had a weapon that gave them a fighting chance against any German tank they might encounter. The confidence was not misplaced. The Pershing's 90mm M3 gun could penetrate 132mm of armour at 1,000 metres range, sufficient to defeat the frontal armour of any German tank except the Tiger II at close range. The armour protection on the Pershing's frontal arc was 100mm thick, angled at 46 degrees, providing effective protection equivalent to approximately 160mm of vertical armour. This was sufficient to defeat the Panther's 75mm gun at ranges beyond 500 metres and to resist most German anti-tank guns, except the 88mm at close range. German tank crews, who had grown accustomed to engaging Shermans with near impunity, suddenly faced American tanks that required the same careful tactical approach they employed against Soviet heavy tanks on the Eastern Front. The first engagement between a Pershing and German armour in the Remagen sector occurred on March 9th near the village of Niederbiber, approximately 6 kilometres east of the bridge. Lieutenant John Grimball's Pershing, operating as part of a combined tank and infantry task force, encountered a Panther positioned in a defensive ambush along the road leading toward the Westerwald highlands. The German tank opened fire first, its 75mm round striking the Pershing's frontal armour at approximately 700 metres range. The round penetrated the outer armour plate but was stopped by the backing plate, causing no casualties and minimal damage to the tank's combat systems. Grimball's gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, returned fire within seconds. The 90mm armour-piercing round struck the Panther's turret face and penetrated completely, detonating the ammunition storage and killing the entire crew instantly. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds from first shot to destruction of the German tank. The tactical lessons were immediately apparent to both sides. The Pershing could survive hits from German tank guns that would have destroyed a Sherman, and it could destroy German heavy tanks with single shots at ranges where German crews had previously felt secure. Word of the engagement spread through both armies with remarkable speed. American tank crews who heard about Grimball's Pershing surviving a Panther hit requested transfers to Pershing units. German tank commanders who learned that Americans now possessed heavy tanks capable of penetrating Panther armour began modifying their tactical approaches, treating Pershings with the same caution they reserved for Soviet IS-2 heavy tanks on the Eastern Front. The psychological impact of the Pershing's presence at Remagen extended far beyond the relatively small number of tanks actually deployed. 3rd Armoured Division had only 20 Pershings among hundreds of Shermans, a ratio that would have been tactically insignificant if judged purely by numbers. But the Pershings were deployed at critical points in the American advance, positioned where they would be most visible to German forces and where they could engage the heaviest German armour. The effect was to create uncertainty among German defenders about how many Pershings the Americans actually possessed and whether any German tank could safely engage American armour without risking encounter with a heavy tank. German intelligence officers attempting to assess American Pershing deployment faced the same analytical problems that had plagued their understanding of American industrial capacity throughout the war. They could count individual Pershings identified in specific engagements, but they could not determine production rates or deployment schedules with any accuracy. Reports from the Remagen sector documented at least 8 different Pershings identified by tactical numbers or crew names. Reports from other sectors of the Western Front documented additional Pershings in action with 1st Army and 9th Army units. German analysts attempting to calculate total Pershing strength in Europe reached estimates ranging from 40 to over 200 tanks, reflecting the uncertainty created by inadequate intelligence and the American practice of rapidly redeploying armor between sectors. The actual number of Pershings in Europe by mid-March was approximately 70 tanks, with 20 assigned to 3rd Armored Division at Remagen and the remainder distributed among 1st Army and 9th Army units conducting Rhine crossing operations at other locations. The relatively small number was sufficient to achieve the psychological objective of convincing German commanders that American heavy tank deployment was extensive and growing. The presence of Pershings at Remagen complicated German defensive planning in ways that transcended simple tactical calculations. Wehrmacht commanders attempting to organize counterattacks against the American bridgehead had to assume that any American armored formation might include Pershings capable of destroying their best tanks. This assumption forced them to commit their own heavy armor, primarily Tigers and Panthers, to sectors where they might encounter Pershings, rather than holding them in reserve for decisive counterstrokes. The result was a dissipation of limited German armored strength across multiple defensive positions, rather than concentration for offensive action. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had replaced Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt as commander of German forces in the West on March 10, immediately grasped the strategic implications of losing the Remagen Bridge. Kesselring had built his reputation as a defensive specialist through his skillful conduct of the Italian campaign, where he had repeatedly delayed Allied advances through expert use of terrain and limited forces. But Italy had provided defensive advantages that Western Germany lacked, particularly mountain ranges that channeled Allied attacks into predictable corridors where German forces could concentrate. The Rhine Valley offered no such advantages. Once the Americans had established their bridgehead at Remagen, they possessed multiple axes of advance into the relatively open terrain of central Germany. Kesselring's assessment of the situation, documented in his post-war memoirs and interrogation reports, reflected clear understanding that the Remagen bridgehead represented a strategic catastrophe that no amount of tactical skill could reverse. The Americans had achieved what German defensive doctrine had been designed to prevent. They had crossed the Rhine in strength, they had broken through the prepared defensive belt on the eastern bank, and they now possessed freedom of maneuver into the German interior. The presence of American heavy tanks complicated an already impossible situation by eliminating the tactical advantage German armor had enjoyed over Sherman's. Kesselring ordered immediate concentration of all available armor against the Remagen bridgehead, directing units from as far away as Bavaria and the Netherlands to redeploy to the Rhine sector. The orders were issued with full knowledge that they were probably futile, that German armor deploying to Remagen would likely arrive in scattered groups, low on fuel, and vulnerable to American air attack. But the strategic situation left no alternative. Allowing the Americans to break out from Remagen without opposition would mean the immediate collapse of German defenses across the entire Western Front. The counterattacks that developed against the Remagen bridgehead during the second week of March demonstrated both German tactical skill and the fundamental material imbalances that made German defeat inevitable. Wehrmacht units attacking American positions fought with determination and professional competence that had characterized German military operations throughout the war. Individual German tank crews demonstrated tactical expertise superior to their American counterparts in many engagements. German infantry showed remarkable resilience despite catastrophic casualties and collapsing logistics. None of these factors could overcome the basic arithmetic of the situation. American forces at Remagen outnumbered German attackers by ratios exceeding 5-1 in infantry, 3-1 in armor, and 10-1 in artillery. American air superiority was absolute, with 9th Air Force fighter bombers attacking any German movement detected during daylight hours. American logistics could sustain continuous operations, while German supply lines were collapsing under the strain of Allied bombing and the loss of industrial regions in Western Germany. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The engagement on March 11th between a Pershing commanded by Sergeant Bob Early and a German Tiger I near the town of Köttingen became one of the most documented tank duels of the final months of the war. Early's Pershing was advancing as part of a reconnaissance patrol when it encountered the Tiger positioned in a hull-down position behind an earthen berm, presenting only its turret to American view. The German crew had selected an excellent ambush position that maximized the Tiger's advantages in armor and firepower while minimizing exposure to American fire. The Tiger fired first, its 88mm round striking the Pershing's frontal armor at approximately 850 meters range. The round failed to penetrate, gouging a deep scar in the armor plate but not breaking through. Early's gunner immediately returned fire, the 90mm round striking the Tiger's turret mantlet and ricocheting upward without penetrating. Both tanks fired again almost simultaneously. The German round struck the Pershing's lower hull, penetrating the thinner belly armor and damaging the transmission but not disabling the tank. The American round struck the Tiger's turret side armor and penetrated, killing 2 crew members and destroying the turret traverse mechanism. The Tiger, immobilized by mechanical failure of its turret systems, attempted to maneuver to bring its fixed gun to bear on the Pershing. Early's driver reversed the Pershing behind cover, while the loader worked frantically to prepare another armor-piercing round. The third exchange occurred at closer range, as both tanks maneuvered for position. The American round struck the Tiger's frontal armor and penetrated through a weld seam that had been weakened by previous combat damage. The Tiger exploded as its ammunition detonated, the force of the blast throwing the 54-ton turret several meters from the hull. Early's Pershing remained operational despite damage to its transmission, limping back to American lines under its own power. The engagement demonstrated that the Pershing could survive hits from the most powerful German tank gun in service and could destroy Tigers in direct combat under conditions that would have been suicidal for a Sherman. German tank crews who learned about the engagement understood that American armor had achieved parity with German heavy tanks, eliminating the technical advantage that had been one of the Wehrmacht's few remaining strengths. The mechanical reliability of the Pershing in combat operations exceeded what German intelligence had predicted, based on their assessment of American automotive engineering. The Kummersdorf testing facility had documented Sherman mechanical excellence in exhaustive detail during 1943 and 1944, proving that American tanks possessed automotive reliability far superior to German designs. German intelligence officers had assumed, incorrectly, that American heavy tanks would sacrifice reliability for increased weight and firepower, following the same pattern that had plagued German Tiger and Panther development. The Pershing proved this assumption wrong. The tank incorporated the same design philosophy that had made the Sherman reliable. Generous design margins, automotive-grade components, proven in commercial service, and acceptance of adequate performance over theoretical maximums. The Ford GAA engine in the Pershing was the same engine used in late-production Shermans, requiring no specialized maintenance procedures or unique spare parts. The transmission used modified Sherman components, familiar to any American tank mechanic. The suspension incorporated lessons learned from years of Sherman field service, producing a system that required minimal adjustment and tolerated poor maintenance. The operational availability of Pershings deployed to 3rd Armored Division at Remagen remained above 75% throughout the period from March 8 through March 25, a rate comparable to Sherman's, and far exceeding the availability rates. German Panthers achieved even after improvements addressed the worst early mechanical problems. German commanders, receiving reports that American heavy tanks were maintaining Sherman-level reliability, understood that American industry had solved problems German engineers still struggled with after years of development. The industrial implications were devastating to German morale at the command level. The United States had developed a heavy tank comparable to German designs in less time than it took German factories to address Panther reliability problems. American industry was producing Pershings alongside Shermans without disrupting overall tank output, while German industry struggled to produce any tanks as bombing intensified and resource shortages worsened. American logistics could deliver Pershings to combat units in Europe within weeks of production, while German logistics struggled to deliver spare parts for existing vehicles in Germany itself. Every metric demonstrated American industrial superiority that rendered German technical sophistication irrelevant. The comparison between Pershing and Panther development timelines illustrated the fundamental difference between American and German approaches to weapons production. The Panther had been conceived in November 1941 as a response to the Soviet T-34 tank, encountered during the invasion of Russia. Development continued through 1942 with multiple design iterations and extensive testing. Production began in January 1943, 26 months after initial conception. Early production Panthers suffered catastrophic mechanical failures, particularly transmission and final drive breakdowns that immobilized tanks within 100 kilometers of delivery. Extensive modifications were required through late 1943 and early 1944 before Panthers achieved acceptable reliability. The total development time from conception to fielding of reliable production vehicles was approximately 30 months. The Pershing had been conceived in early 1943 as a response to German heavy tanks encountered in North Africa. Serious development began in mid-1943 after combat commanders demanded better tanks. Production began in November 1944, approximately 18 months after serious development started. The first production Pershings deployed to combat units in February 1945 demonstrated mechanical reliability comparable to Sherman's from initial deployment, requiring no extended debugging period. The total development time from conception to fielding of combat-ready vehicles was approximately 24 months, and the tanks worked correctly from the beginning. The German approach had prioritized technical sophistication and maximum performance specifications, accepting extended development time and initial reliability problems as necessary costs. The American approach had prioritized rapid deployment and immediate operational effectiveness, accepting performance compromises as necessary to field working weapons quickly. The results validated the American philosophy. Pershings reached combat units soon enough to influence the final campaigns of the war, while Panthers required so long to debug that early models were unreliable even as the war approached its end. The tactical employment of Pershings at Remagen followed American combined arms doctrine that had evolved through years of combat experience across multiple theaters. The tanks were not employed as independent heavy tank battalions concentrated for breakthrough operations, the approach favored by German and Soviet doctrine. Instead, they were distributed among standard tank companies as reinforcement for existing units, providing heavy firepower and armor protection within formations built around Sherman's. This approach reflected American understanding that heavy tanks were tools for specific tactical situations rather than universal weapons that should dominate armored formations. Sherman's retained advantages in mobility, reliability, and ease of maintenance that made them superior for exploitation and pursuit operations. Pershings provided capability for engaging heavily armored targets and breaking through fortified positions that Sherman struggled against. The combination of both tank types in the same formation provided tactical flexibility that neither could achieve alone. Lieutenant Colonel William Lovelady, commanding the tank battalion that included several Pershings during the Remagen breakout, later described the tactical utility of mixed tank formations in his after-action reports. Sherman's led advances across open terrain, using their superior mobility to outmaneuver German defenses and their automotive reliability to sustain rapid movement. When German heavy tanks or fortified positions blocked the advance, Pershings moved forward to engage threats that Sherman's could not safely handle. Once the immediate obstacle was eliminated, Sherman's resumed the advance while Pershings consolidated gains and prepared for the next serious opposition. This flexible employment maximized the strengths of both tank types while minimizing the impact of their respective weaknesses. German tactical doctrine, by contrast, concentrated heavy tanks in dedicated heavy tank battalions that operated as elite formations assigned to critical sectors. This approach produced local superiority when the heavy tanks were present, but left most formations entirely dependent on medium tanks, inadequate for engaging Allied heavy armor. The German system required sophisticated command and control to coordinate heavy tank deployment across multiple sectors, capabilities that were degrading rapidly as communications broke down and command structures collapsed. The American system distributed heavy tank capability throughout the force, providing every major formation with at least some ability to engage heavy enemy armor without requiring complex coordination. The industrial sustainability of the two approaches differed as dramatically as their tactical effectiveness. American production of Pershings continued at increasing rates through the final months of the war. Fisher Tank Arsenal delivered 310 Pershings by May 1945, with production scheduled to accelerate through the summer. The tanks were produced alongside continuing Sherman production, demonstrating American industrial capacity to manufacture multiple vehicle types simultaneously. Plans existed to produce over 1,200 Pershings by the end of 1945 if the war continued. German production of heavy tanks, by comparison, was collapsing under the combined pressure of Allied bombing and raw material shortages. Panther production peaked at 379 tanks in July 1944 and declined steadily thereafter. Tiger II production never exceeded 100 tanks per month and ceased entirely in March 1945 as factories were captured or destroyed. The Wehrmacht was losing heavy tanks faster than industry could replace them, while American armored strength was growing despite heavy combat losses. The trajectory of the two industrial systems pointed toward inevitable conclusions that German commanders could no longer deny. The breakout from the Remagen bridgehead began on March 25, 3 weeks after the bridge's initial capture. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.